What I'm going to talk about now is a project I've been involved in for the last several years on a small herd that overlaps the border with Canada. And I'm going to give you sort of an overview of a sort of a biological issue and a socio-political context in which it occurs. There's some biology in here, but I'm going to essentially talk about the dynamics, very briefly about the dynamics of a small declining population, and then a management action that we've been involved in to try to stimulate the growth of this population. Oop. Do I have to point it at where do I point?
Other arrow.
Oh, that's the back arrow. Okay. The Chisana caribou herd lives along the Canadian border, like I mentioned, and to just give you a little bit of frame of reference, this is the Alcan going through here, town of Beaver Creek, and this is the boundary running right up through here. So this is the White River here flowing out of Wrangell-St. Elias National Park. This herd largely lives within Wrangell-St. Elias National Park and Preserve, and then on the Canadian side within the Kluane Game Sanctuary. In about 2001, there was quite a bit of interest and concern expressed over the population trend here for the Chisana caribou, which had declined quite a bit since the late 1989, late 1980s. And the thing that was going on was that there was pretty low calf survival. So as the herd declined, what harvest was going on, which was kind of limited, I think it was shut down about 1992 or so, 93. And the herd continued to decline, and we had pretty low calf survival for a pretty long stretch of time. So at about 2001, after we had a series of meetings over some years, there was concern that, at the rate this herd was declining, which is about 12% a year, that it wasn't going to be too long and these caribou were going to go out of existence. So with that in mind, there was quite a bit of discussion about what we should do. And it was an interesting situation because this herd really, it depended on which side of the border how you looked at this particular situation. And if you look at it from the Canadian perspective, the Chisana caribou herd is this little one, this one right here outlined in black. And it's one of about 22 woodland, northern mountain ecotype of woodland caribou within northwestern Canada. And in Canada, woodland caribou, their southern counterpart, southern mountain woodland caribou, and then the boreal ecotype woodland caribou are both basically considered endangered. And there's a heck of a lot of concern about the future of these populations. And COSEWIC, which I can never remember what that acronym stands for, but it's essentially a committee that determines, signifies which populations or species are endangered within Canada or at risk, has denoted these northern mountain ecotype as being of concern because there tend to be small populations, and there's concern that given enough time they may end up following the same trajectories as these more southerly populations. They don't operate on a population-specific basis, however, but within the Yukon, because of these concerns and the decline in this particular herd, there was a pretty major effort to list these animals as specially protected. So essentially this population within the Yukon is considered a species at risk, and their management direction kind of comes from an endangered species sort of direction. Whereas here in Alaska, these guys are just another caribou. And there really is no special consideration. I mean, everybody's kind of interested in the herd's declining, but it really isn't a sort of standout situation. So, given these demographic concerns, what happened is that there was a decision within the Yukon government largely, and with quite a bit of involvement of the White River First Nation, that they got to do something. They had to do something. They couldn't just let this herd continue to decline. So they came up with the idea of attempting an effort to do captive rearing, which I'll explain here in a minute. And this was essentially trying to come up with some approach other than the standard approach, which has been predator control. And partially as a result, because this population lives within essentially two protected areas, And the other thing that was necessary was to increase the monitoring effort to some degree, and that's kind of where I came in. Well, so I'm just going to very briefly talk about the population status from 2001 until now, and then talk about the captive rearing. But again, if you go back to what the population trend, pretty sizable rate of decline, about 12% per year. But as it turns out, I think this is a very interesting case history in how some very well-intentioned and qualified biologists who have very limited funding can be led astray. And also this can result in some pretty major management action. So we started the captive rearing program in 2003. One of the outcomes of that was that we doubled the number of radio collars in the park. So 2003, a bunch of confusion when the fall comes around and the standard counts are done. There's more caribou out there than anybody thought. Lo and behold, twice as many radios, twice as many caribou. And I was given the nickname "the ugly truth" when this happened, because I was the one that came up with this number. And nobody wanted to do anything until we could corroborate it. So by that time, the captive rearing effort was rolling along. So 2005, we get conditions again to do this kind of market capture census, and we've got a lot more radios out there, and lo and behold, we come up with a pretty comparable estimate. So right off the bat, we find out we've got twice as many caribou, and this is no longer really an endangered or species at risk kind of situation. Also, at the same time, we got sort of an uptick in calf survival out here in these same years. And calf survival in the fall essentially about tripled. So the captive rearing, in a nutshell, the idea is to try to eliminate the mortality that occurs to calves shortly after birth. So we caught a bunch of pregnant females, stuck them in a big pen, kept them until their calves were released in mid-June, or until their calves were produced and a few weeks old, and we released them all in mid-June. And through this year, we've handled about 150 cows through the 4 years of the effort here. These animals are net gunned, bagged up, thrown in a helicopter, flown to a pen that's really easy to put up. I can say that because I never had to do it. Out in the middle of nowhere, and they're processed, radio collared, ultrasounded to determine if they're pregnant or not, and released into this pen where they're held for 2.5 months. And there's quite a bit of surveillance around this pen to keep the idea is to keep the predators out of this pen while these calves are being produced and getting their feet under them. Electric fencing around the pen, regular patrols around the pen to keep the predators at bay. Okay, so what happened? Well, it worked pretty well. You put them in a pen for a few weeks after the calves are born. They do pretty well. At the time we released them, we had 95% survival of calves born in the pen versus about 33% survival for those in the wild. And once they went out, surprisingly enough, they even did better when they went out. We're not exactly sure what this is, but it could have something to do with increased, we really poured the feed to them in the pen. It's possible that these calves might have been in better shape than their counterpart in the wild. And you put those two periods of time together, and you end up with about 6 times the survival of calves coming out of this pen as you do out of the wild. So that's the good news. The bad news is that this is all a big numbers game. And if you've got a large population that you're dealing with, you can't make a very big contribution to the herd. We did change the fall calf-cow ratios by a little bit there. In fact, when we were operational by 2005, about a third of the calves that were in the population came out of the pen, which is a pretty good contribution. But if you look at the population dynamics of the herd as a whole, through this sort of captive rearing effort, what we found is that we maxed out at about 50 cows is what we could handle through this penning operation. And at that rate, we could jack up the population from a decline of about 6% per year up to about 2%. So what's happened is that this approach has actually been adopted for use in southern Canada, where they do have small populations where you can put 15 or 20 cows in a pen and potentially make a big effect. And this effort in the Chisana herd has really largely been more of an experiment to try to figure out the techniques to be applied elsewhere to do something within the Chisana herd itself. And a lot of people involved in this project. This is a small segment of them, but just to name off the agencies involved, it's the Yukon Department of Environment, Canadian Wildlife Service, White River First Nation, the Yukon Fish and Wildlife Management Board, all on the Canadian side, and then USGS ranked St. Elias. Mason Reed has been heavily involved. Alaska Department of Fish and Game, and some collaboration with UAF. And with that, I'm finished.